What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, calling from the quarantine zone again, and this time we are here with Justin of WristMeetRazor. Thank you so much for being here today, man. It's great to have you on here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so cool to have you here. We got the new album Replica of a Strange Love coming out this June. Right now, the first single that we released was Last Tango in Paris, which features members of Knocked Loose. Is this maybe a good representation of what the entirety of Replica is going to sound like, or is that just one little piece of the puzzle in a way?
It's a piece of the puzzle for sure. I would say that it is a taste of what the record is, but I would not say that it's the entirety of it. There's a lot of different stuff that's going to come out with it, though. I think some people, especially people that are super critical, would want it to be the whole record. Right now, it seems like some people like to already jump the gun and think that the whole thing's going to sound like this one song, and it's not. So
Yeah.
so to their dismay, it's not like that all the way through, at least.
Yeah. Does it have any like relationship or any maybe methods of continuation to Misery Never Forgets, or were you trying to maybe step into a lot more uncharted territory and experiment a little bit more with the sound?
Uh, Instrumentally, I think it's fairly different. It's not entirely different. We'll always have a lot of the same kind of influences as far as like what we want to do as a band. It's more of an evolution, I think. I think Risk Me Razor as a band has always been about evolving more and more, and not necessarily doing stuff because we are expected to, just doing stuff because it's like kind of what we want to do. And it's been a thing where we've been, and it's understandable, but we've been kind of pigeonholed into different kind of things, different kind of like genres of being like a scene band or whatever that is. And that while we don't like, I'm not going to denounce that. We didn't have expectations. We didn't start with the intention of being that. It kind of just is a natural thing for us that, we do what we want to do, and whatever people say is kind of what they say. And that's essentially more or less what this record's going to be too.
Yeah.
So.
Well, like what's interesting is, I discovered you on it was Sharp Tooth that you played with at the Kingsland, and my friends in the Machinist, and like that's where I like, wow, this band is good. And then I kind of got lost into everything you released previously, and like I really think you bring up a good point. Like, I don't consider Replica of a Strange Love to be the continuation of Misery Never Forgets, and I don't consider Misery Never Forgets to be like a direct continuation of But the Sky is Empty EP. It's more or less everything is just like a continuation of evolution, right?
Right, exactly. It's more or less what what we're building in the aesthetic, and it's all about growing kind of from where we came from to where we want to be. And yeah, and I think it's easy for a lot of people. If you're a music listener and you want to hear a certain thing, and then you hear whatever it is that we kind of visualize or what we want to do. I think it's understandable for some people to be turned off by that, especially if they more so preferred some of the more screamo influences, or even if they preferred some of the early 2000s metalcore influence. So from Misery Never Forgets, it's understandable if maybe they hear some of the new stuff and they don't like it as much. But ultimately, where we're going with it, I think, is in much more interesting directions. I think if people stick around and they give it a chance, they're going to really like it, especially with all the different vibes that kind of play into the same thing here.
Does it start off with like a preconceived idea, your songwriting process, like you want it to be like this, or is there maybe like a lot of trial and error in a way?
There's a lot of trial and error for sure. There's a lot of kind of ideas that never fully pan out too. Like we throw a lot of things out there and try to see what makes the most sense for us and what we're able to work with the most in the writing process. It's usually started by a couple riffs. There's usually ideas in the beginning, but the finished product is never what the starting kind of thing is. But ultimately, especially with Risk Me Razor, more so than a lot of bands, I would say, there is a bit of a group effort towards what we're doing. All of it is group oriented and kind of created in a way that it has to has to kind of go through the filter of each of us individually. So a lot of what you get isn't necessarily, while, you know, I write all the lyrics now, I'm not the only one writing riffs. And I think a lot of people, when they're listening to different bands, don't realize that a lot of their favorite bands are just one guy that writes all the lyrics, all the riffs, everything. And that's not how WristMeetRazor is. So in that sense, it's definitely different.
Yeah. Do you feel that as a vocalist that sometimes maybe a concept or a lyrical idea can maybe influence the direction of the music itself, or do you always prefer to have music presented to you before you start the lyrical writing process?
I personally, I'm very big on writing lyrics that do the song justice instrumentally. So we always start with instrumentals. However, as far as like concepts go and aesthetics, I'm always writing lyrics down. Like I definitely have a running note tab on my phone where I write lyrics all the time, concepts, thoughts, stuff like that, things that end up playing into what the songs end up being. But I would never want to write. See, I think certain people like writing full songs and then just like shoehorning them into, you know, uh, riffs and songs that were written instrumentally. But I would never want to do that. I think it's really important that as far as like the technical aspect of songwriting, I think it's important that you do justice to the song.
Yeah.
So more so.
Definitely. And going back to your collaborative efforts with the band too, I think that's really good that like, it seems like not only do you write together, but it almost seems like you all inspire each other too and it maybe you all teach each other new things and help discover different artistic aspects that you never knew you had, right?
Yeah. And ultimately, even though we all have our different flares, there is a one goal that we always are reaching for. And on Replica, I think it's very clear what that goal is. And when people listen to it, it's gonna, even though the singles might sound a bit disjointed outside of the concept or the context of the record, I think when you listen to the record, it all flows in a way that makes sense to one consistent aesthetic and one consistent kind of theme.
So you feel that like, I mean, because I've always thought that there's a difference between an album being a concept album and an album just being conceptual. But obviously
Right.
every musician wants their listeners to listen to the full length album. But do you think that this album is conceptually driven enough where they need to start off with Our Distress Entwined and end with All the Way Alive, or could a listener like kind of approach this from any angle they want, shuffle friendly, as I like to say?
Right. I mean, in theory, I think anything could be shuffle friendly, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're just kind of like digging a certain vibe, you can shuffle anything. I think if you want the record to make some sort of sense, I think listening to it front to back is what we intended. We put a lot of work into making it a record. Growing up, I definitely enjoyed records that, even if they weren't necessarily concept records, when you listen to them front to back, you can get a full emotional kind of cross section and snapshot of like what the artist was thinking and what they wanted out of the experience. Like records like Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails, like that record, while it's vaguely a concept record, it's mostly just a record. And if you listen to it front to back, you get a much different feeling than if you just listen to the singles or you just play around on the record. And I always kind of loved that about really classic records, is you can listen to it front to back and you get a completely different feeling than you do if you're just listening to the singles. And I think in a way we've definitely captured that with this one too. And with the singles coming up too that people haven't heard yet, I think there's a lot to take in with it.
There definitely is. And like I think you have a great way of doing it because like, some people feel like a concept album is very limited, like it's only meant to be interpreted this way. Sometimes the listener, there have been times where certain concept albums are so conceptually driven that it kind of alienates a listener who just wants to listen to the music. But like I feel like this album is also just as much open to interpretation as well, right?
Right, totally. Yeah, I think everything is. I would never want to put anything out into the world that has Well, and I don't mean to say never, because sometimes I think there is a time and place for like exact concept records, like records that have one concept and you're supposed to be following it throughout. However, in the term and in the place that WristMeetRazor is, and in terms of what WristMeetRazor does, I think it works so much better when there's no concept that's pinpointable and like one tiny thing. Like, it's so much better when anyone can listen to any of the tracks or listen to it as a whole and just take multiple different things from it. And that's certainly the direction I think we wanted to go with this one, is that it is very much open to a lot of interpretation, lyrically and instrumentally. Honestly, I think the instrumentals on this thing can definitely be interpreted a bunch of different ways. You could name any number of different influences that we could have had on many of the songs, and I would probably agree that it influenced the whole record as opposed to one song, even if, you know, certain songs seem to take different influences from certain things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that represents, it has to, there's no denying that everybody in the band also has different inspirations as well, right? So like I'd imagine that
Yeah.
you try to let your different influences and your different tastes maybe equally shine on there, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent, like I think while we do all have our own unique backgrounds and stuff like that, when it comes to WristMeetRazor, we do to a certain extent all kind of come to an agreement on kind of where that's going. So we definitely, when we're writing songs, we bring our own unique kind of flavors to it, but there's a goal in mind. So those influences aren't necessarily as important as the greater goal of the record, if that makes sense. I mean, the record is always what kind of like takes precedence. So we put ourselves through that filter in order to make it come to life as much as possible. I think with this record in particular, it was so unique because Isaac from Knocked Loose produced the whole thing, and we went to Kentucky and wrote it with him. So that in that aspect, it's almost like we added another member. And not only that, but we added another member that also was putting himself through the same kind of filter that we were. And that added a dynamic that we've never had before. We've never had, you know, a person that wasn't directly in our day-to-day kind of thing giving their interpretation of you know, what we are, and then us kind of like bouncing it back and forth and having this, you know, this very interesting discourse about what it is that we want to do and what it is that our end goal is and what, you know, this should be. And I think that played a lot into how this sounds. A lot.
100%. And there is like a, you know, I don't want to say it's a drastic change, but you could tell that there was a lot of evolution and almost kind of like a lot of a no bullshit sort of attitude going between this and your last album. Because while I thought like a Misery Never Forgets was all really, really good, and especially but the Sky's Empty EP as well, they all really left me wanting more and all left me hungry, which is great. But what I think is so great about Replica of a Strange Love is that it could really like fulfill that hunger in a way. I feel like that this is kind of like the moment that we have all been waiting for in a way, you know?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate your kind of take on that, because that's how I feel too. This is, I mean, it's by far the longest thing we've done, but I think it's the most realized that we've been to. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you look at every album too as like maybe a self-portrait, like, or like as a good representation of who you personally are? Like, do you like would you say that Misery Never Forgets is who you were in 2018, but the Sky's Empty EP, that was 2017, right? Yeah.
That was 2017. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. So the way that WristMeetRazor has been is kind of interesting. We've not necessarily always functioned the way that we currently do. So for the most part, originally, not to go too deep into the history of the band, because it's usually not something I like doing that much. But originally, the band was Jonah and I, when we began writing all of the stuff that ended up being I Talk to God, but the Sky is Empty. And that was going to be one LP. That whole thing was going to be one LP. And my vocal parts on that were more secondary, because I was mostly the bassist at that time. So I actually I wrote I wrote 2 songs on that one lyrically and did vocals, backup vocals. I guess our vocals are kind of even, but mostly backup vocals on all of those tracks. So that one is interesting. And the couple things that I did write, I think they are definitely snapshots of that time period of 2017. For Misery Never Forgets, Jonah and I basically split the writing duties for this tracks. So I wrote half the lyrics, he wrote half the lyrics. That was definitely when the whole vocal thing became much more of a 50-50 thing. And at times it might have split a little bit more in one direction or a little bit more in the other. That record is obviously interesting to an extent because, as you previously mentioned, the record is much shorter than the current one that we're putting out, and the songs are shorter. So there wasn't a ton of room to do much more than that. You know what I mean? If it wasn't a song that was over 2.5 minutes, whoever wrote it was going to have the most lyrics because it's a 2-minute track or a 1.5-minute track. There's just not a lot of room for that for the dynamics. But for this one, now that the songs are a lot longer, this one is entirely a good snapshot of myself during 2020. And I think Misery Never Forgets is also a great snapshot of myself in 2018, which is when we wrote that one. So to that extent, yeah, absolutely.
In order to get like that lyrical or just that creative energy or that inspiration, do you almost look for it? Like, is there kind of like a usual place you have to go to or a usual realm you need to be in order for like the ideas to come through, or does the inspiration like always strike when you least expect it?
My inspiration is usually kind of sporadic. I mean, I'm more or less the kind of guy that likes to write everything down and then revisit it later in different concepts. I think for the most part, this also ties back into what we were talking about earlier. It's more about doing justice and serving the song and serving the instrumentals. And so when I hear the instrumentals, I can start gathering my thoughts a lot better that way. But the original aspect of it is that it's conceptual at its base, I think, at least.
Yeah, 100%. And like, do you almost find though, like, because I feel like I don't know if this is a goal or something that you have in mind with WristMeetRazor, but like, I feel like your music really captures a moment. Like, I feel like that, for like the entirety of the last single that you put out, like I feel like that captures a moment. Like, and once it starts to when it ends, that moment is gone after, you know what I mean? It's not there before it starts and it's gone when it ends. And like, do you feel that like the longer you're working on something, the harder it is to kind of like maintain that emotional spark or even capture that moment in a way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's interesting. Last Tango in Paris had a completely different set of lyrics. I wrote that one in quarantine. So we pre-prod all this in February, which was before the pandemic. And I wrote all the lyrics in quarantine in the pandemic. And the original lyrics to Last Tango were completely different. And it was basically exactly what you said. Like, to me, it's all about capturing a moment that can stand on its own. And that it was rewritten into how it is now. And it's mostly because I think that it has to be one like consistent thing, especially with tracks like that. Like, they have to have a very strong beginning, middle, and end. And so, I think that's the case for every track on the record, to be honest with you. I think they all capture one specific moment. I would sit down and write them all consistently. So I wouldn't write like little pieces of every track. I would write the full song until it was done lyrically, every song. So that it captures that moment that I wrote it, for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And like, like again, like I can't picture Last Tango in Paris being over like 3 minutes and 45 seconds or whatever that is. And then you have a song like Nietzsche is Dead that's just a minute and a half. Like, I can't picture that. Like, I think if it goes 1 minute over, or if you left out like another minute in between that, it would just kill it. So like
Right.
You really do have kind of an instinctual thing working in your favor.
Yeah. And the good thing about WristMeetRazor is we did a lot with a little. when we started, our tracks were always pretty short, and so we feel very at home in the short track kind of running thing. And so doing the longer tracks, we were almost ready for it, because if you can set up a short track to be everything in like 2 minutes, it's easier to set up everything in 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes. You have an extra minute and a half to build everything. So
Yeah.
we were prepared for it, I think.
Yeah, and as somebody who reviews a shit ton of progressive bands with 27.5-minute long songs, it's a breath of fresh air to hear your stuff. And the final question I wanted to ask you is again, I've said it before, but at the show that you played at the Kingsland in Brooklyn with Sharptooth, great show. That's how I discovered you. Been a fan ever since. And I love listening to the music. I get lost in your catalog, but it definitely is a different energy. And this isn't just you; it's every band. There's always a different energy playing live than in the album. But I could tell that you pour your heart into both equally the same. So, is there anything that ties in playing live? Is there any similarity to playing live as there is when you're writing or recording or anything like that, or do you consider playing live and recording two completely separate arts?
They're definitely two completely separate arts, but for the most part, it's while writing songs, the whole mindset is, how is this going to come off live, and is this going to be something that we can do live? I think heavy music especially needs to be performed live. Like, it needs to have a live aspect to it. Most of it isn't music that's, I think you can definitely listen to it on its own, but creating the kind of performance art aspect of it in a live setting is undeniably what it makes this music the most captivating. It captivates anyone that wants to watch and get into it. And the live aspect of it is just kind of an emotional and raw thing that it's hard to really completely capture that on record, but I think it's important to have that aspect too.
Yeah, you come pretty damn close to it, let me tell you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time and for this conversation.
Sure, of course.
Is there just anything else with Wrist Meet Razor you would like to promote? The album comes out June 11th, right?
It does. The album comes out June 11th. We're pre-ordering it right now on www.wristmeetrazor.com. We have some pre-order merch items too that you won't be able to buy beforehand. And the first press of our vinyl is running low. So if you're trying to get a first run of Replica before it comes out, I'd recommend doing that pretty soon here.
Yeah. Is there just anything else that you would like to promote? Like, obviously, thanks to the godforsaken virus that shall not be named on my channel. Obviously, shows are not happening at the moment, but like, obviously, when all this shit is over, and hopefully it's over soon, we'll definitely be seeing y'all on the road quite a bit, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Nothing to really actually announce with that, but hopefully later this year, definitely all of 2022, we'll be out there. So,
and we look forward to doing it, and hope to see you back in New York again soon.
Of course, one of our favorite spots. Awesome. We'll be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Wrist Meet Razor, Replica of a Strange Love, out June 11th via Prosthetic. This is Alex from Heavy New York.